Thank you, Speaker. On behalf of the Greens, I rise to support the First Home Buyers Legislation Amendment Bill 2023. While the Greens want to see an equitable transition from stamp duty to a broad-based progressive land tax, this is not what the First Home Buyer Choice Scheme amounted to. Thanks to our Greens colleagues in the ACT, who in a working and collaborative relationship with the Labor government helped to shepherd in a landmark stamp duty reform in that territory, we know that genuine reform in this area, what it can look like, and this scheme is simply not it. The inquiry secured by the Greens in the upper house when this was first introduced by the previous Liberal national government shows us that the First Home Buyer Choice Scheme, as it was named, was neither a housing affordability measure nor an equitable transition away from stamp duty to land tax. So what was it? Well, it was little more than a half-baked attempt at housing policy reform that was always intended to be temporary, and which the former coalition government rushed through in the final sitting weeks before an election. The Greens did not support it as good policy then, and we do not support it now. It's important to note, though, that while we absolutely do support long overdue reforms to stamp duty tax in this state, and we want to see it go further towards implementing a progressive land tax system, we will not be able to have the complex conversation required to be able to do this if we start using scare tactic and continue to use scare tactic rhetoric about a forever tax on your home. The Greens and the progressive housing and tax advocates expect better from Labor, and I would hope that as this conversation continues, we can leave that kind of rhetoric aside and talk about the big challenges we face in the housing system. The Greens did not support the so-called First Home Buyer Choice Scheme then, and we do not support it now. It is not good policy. In the past 6 months, we have seen this scheme, since this scheme was introduced, it is reported to have saved $199.8 million in stamp duty for people. But if you take that another way, this is the state government forfeiting almost $200 million to subsidise people to get into the private property market. Imagine what this almost $200 million could have done to actually support housing affordability in the midst of a worsening crisis. We could have built new public housing. We could have refurbished existing public housing dwellings that are currently uninhabitable and therefore sitting empty. We could have provided cost of living support for renters struggling to meet their weekly housing costs. The list can go on. Instead, nearly $200 million was used to marginally subsidise the cost of home ownership, predominantly for the slim minority of first home buyers who buy properties worth between $1 and $1.5 million. Over the past few weeks, we have heard from people in our communities, and we have heard some of those being raised, both within the Newtown electorate and beyond, who are concerned, understandably, that the rising property prices are making it impossible for them to make the jump to buy a family home near their schools, near their public open spaces, or near their communities. We know that so many people are absolutely desperate right now to try and scrape funds together and purchase a home so that they can escape the completely cooked rental market, even if this means going into massive debt and buying into an overheated property market to do so. It is so clear that for renters, first home buyers, people with a mortgage, across the board, the entire private housing system is broken. The only ones not suffering now are the big investors and the property developers who are continuing to profit from other people's desperation and housing insecurity. But it is also clear that funding private home ownership isn't the solution. Instead, we need to reform rental laws to better protect tenants, offer leases that are longer, and implement rent controls and freeze interest rates now as well as rents. Federally, we need to address the tax handouts and concessions, and we need to be advocating for more than what we are seeing in terms of the federal investment in funding for public and social housing. Rental prices have continued to ascend to astronomical heights as vacancies rates have plummeted, painting an incredibly grim picture for people who rent across the state. We've heard a number of members contributing so far to this debate talking about the rental crisis in their areas, and I would urge those members to have a look more closely in the coming weeks as we introduce a rent freeze bill to this chamber, and I second read that, where we can actually look at having a 2-year rent freeze put in place to put a halt on the pressure put on people currently facing a rental crisis while we move through the reforms that this new Labor government have addressed to implement things like an end to unfair no grounds evictions and other changes that would see a pressure lift on the cost of living. We need time to get that legislation right and those reforms right. I note the Minister for Planning is here in the chamber and he has a vision for how we can increase supply. We need to increase the supply of affordable housing in New South Wales. And while we go about working together on that project, working on the project to end unfair evictions, then a 2-year rent freeze would be a sensible measure. We saw it during the pandemic, and would be a sensible measure to be able to take the pressure off families and off people renting right now while we have time to make those legislative changes. Rental prices have continued to go to astronomical heights. There is very little cold comfort in the promise of being able to choose between a lump sum stamp duty and an annual property tax for 2/3 of low-income renters who can barely afford to pay their weekly rent, let alone even think about the idea of purchasing their own home. The Greens support raising the stamp duty exemption threshold in this legislation to $800,000 and the concession threshold to $1 million, in recognition of the fact that 84% of first home buyers purchase a home below $1 million. And we welcome the extension of residence requirements for first home buyer benefits from 6 to 12 months. The closure of any loophole that allows investors to reap benefits made for people who intend to live in their homes is something the Greens will always support. But we know that the real issue underpinning every discussion of housing affordability in this place is the fact that investors and property developers are still able to make a profit from housing, something that should be a universally accessible human right. Stamp duty may be an old-fashioned tax that we want to see phased out, but it is far from the only barrier that people face when it comes to housing affordability in this state. Scrapping it should never have come at the expense of revenue that could have been used to fund real solutions to the housing affordability crisis, like public and social housing for those who need it most, as well as homelessness and crisis services. A healthy tax base is one of the best ways to redistribute public wealth and address inequality and financial disadvantage by funding the social services our communities need. While we absolutely support the bill before us and we rejected the so-called first home buyers choice scheme, we do recognise the fact that it is important for us to be talking about the idea of a shift from stamp duty to a broad-based, progressive and equality-based land tax. But we will never be able to have that very hard and complex debate if we resort back to tactics where social media tiles and media grabs start using phrases like a forever tax on your home. We need to move beyond that. The people of New South Wales expect better from us when it comes to that, and we need to have a complex conversation about how we make developers, investors, and those who are making profit out of the insecure housing market at the moment that is causing our people and our communities so much stress as a solution and a way forward. The Greens support this bill. We look forward to seeing well thought out and substantive reforms around genuinely improving the housing affordability in this state, and we hope that we can move beyond the type of wedge politics that sees discussions of forever taxes or NIMBYs or YIMBYs or an attempt to try and wedge people, and actually move to a solution that is focused on delivering affordable housing, public housing and social housing, and significant rental reforms for our communities.